Thank you. The title of my presentation is Fighting for Peace, the Rose Dabney Forbes Story, and I just want to give a huge thank you to my advisor, Professor Nina Silber. No one can predict who history will remember, but none of Boston's 20th century elite would have expected Rose Dabney Forbes to be forgotten. The daughter of the U.S. Consul to the Azores, a celebrated activist, Forbes served as an officer of the Massachusetts Peace Society, the chairman of the branch of the Massachusetts Women's Peace Party, and on the advisory council of the World Peace Foundation. Forbes' donations kept alive multiple peace organizations, and she was granted influence in otherwise male-dominated spaces. Her guest lists included presidents and European nobility. I'm sure none of you have ever heard of her. You see, there are no secondary sources dedicated to the life of Rose Dabney Forbes. Forbes' activism does not lend itself to dramatics. Instead of marching and protesting, Forbes donated and hosted. She did so with enormous success. Her donations kept alive multiple peace organizations. Yet Forbes was not wholly selfless for the good of her cause. While other peace activists, most famously Jane Addams, became viewed with suspicion during World War I, Forbes and her Bostonian followers toned down their anti-war messaging and ultimately supported elements of the war rather than facing social rejection. For my Kilachon Keystone project, I wrote the first secondary source dedicated to uncovering the story of Rose Dabney Forbes. In doing so, I examined how and why we remember historical figures, whether remembrance requires admiration, and how patriarchal historiographic norms lose women's stories. Based on archival documents and biographical theory, I argue that Forbes and her peers complicate a male-centric historiographic tradition that favors radical figures. To forget Rose Dabney Forbes and her fellow peace activists is to deny the incredibly powerful work they completed from within their gender and class systems. By tackling international issues from parlors and knitting circles, these women disprove the separate spheres and public versus private perspectives that dominated 1970s and 1980s gender studies discourse. They did not need to enter male spaces to enter political conversations, and they wielded social networks to benefit their cause. Remembering the peace movement requires a reframing of how we write biography that moves away from male-dominated narratives rather than trying to inject women into an already written story. Let's start with Rose Dabney Forbes. Rose Dabney was born on Faial Island, Portugal in 1864 to Sarah Hickling and Samuel Willis Dabney, the U.S. Consul to the Azores. In 1892, Rose moved to Milton, Massachusetts to marry J. Malcolm Forbes. Forbes dedicated her adult life to peace activism. She was the only woman on the establishing committee of the revived Massachusetts Peace Society, and she subsequently served on the board of directors as well. Additionally, she was the chairman for the Massachusetts branch of the Women's Peace Party, a member of the Advisory Council to the World Peace Foundation, and a member of the National Council for the Prevention of War. Forbes' activism centered around donating and hosting. Neither of these actions seem particularly radical to a modern audience, but their role in the peace movement and Gilded Age activism more broadly cannot be understated. Hostessing as a form of activism may appear to be a compromise. Women who could not enter public spaces found ways to create change from their private homes. Yet such movements radically disprove the whole concept of domesticity as its own sphere. By politicizing their homes, these Gilded Age women showed that there was no impenetrable border between public and private. And appearing to work within their social boundaries, they actually disproved the system altogether. Forbes contributed more than just event space to the peace cause. She also gave a lot of money. Like parlor meetings, donations are often perceived as passive. In reality, wealthy women greatly shaped the trajectory of activism movements. Many donors gave their money conditionally, forcing movements to meet a set of demands in order to receive the cash. In this way, they skirted male authority. Women who gave to causes that were not run by women, such as colleges or libraries, greatly affected these male-dominated institutions. In using money to accomplish her goals, Forbes joined a network of Gilded Age women who strategically provided donations as a means of exercising social control and pushing forward activism agendas. Known as ladies of leisure, these women did far more than lounge in their luxurious homes. From parlor meetings and charitable contributions, movements were built, gender roles were subverted, worlds were changed. The Women's Peace Party had a membership high of 40,000 members in 1916, yet just a few names are remembered. And even those remembered are not talked about in conjunction with peace, such as Jane Addams and Catherine Chapman Catt. To understand why this strong female movement has been largely forgotten, I examined the genres of biography and gender history to better understand who gets remembered and why. I found that trends in female biographies over the past 2 centuries include 3 stages: an absence of female stories altogether, accounts of exceptional or controversial women, and a modern push to analyze female stories outside of traditional male success arcs. Reporting Rose Dabney Forbes' story as a way of understanding how women contributed to the peace movement as we currently understand it would subscribe to an old-fashioned view of women's history as the addition of women to already constructed historical narratives. Still, even just adding female voices at all was considered groundbreaking less than a century ago. After female stories were largely ignored or lost for generations, the early 20th century saw the emergence of historians interested in rediscovering these stories. In the 1930s and 1940s, history began to move away from the great man approach and towards the people's history approach. In this traditional view of social history, each seemingly indistinct life has value because it provides a window into a larger historical picture. Countering this perspective is a micro approach that defends the value of saving individual lives for their own sake. This notion, which is largely rooted in feminist scholarship, argues that definitions of noteworthy are subjective and socially constructed. Therefore, rather than searching for how ordinary or insignificant lives reflect more recognizable historical trends, biographers should search for meanings within each life and treat success in relation to its significance within the life of the subject, not through a lens of later significance. Furthermore, because traditional historical narratives were constructed from a powerful male perspective, rather than searching for how lesser-known figures can help us understand the history that we've already written as a society, such lives can be used to ponder whether our current framing of history is reality or constructed through outdated norms. Such a viewpoint increases the likelihood that female stories will be remembered because female narratives do not follow traditional male success arcs. Women's lives frequently do not hit the same benchmarks that delineate the traditional biographical structure, such as going to school, leaving the home for work, and entering the public positions. Writing about a female subject, therefore, requires a biographer to design a new template within which to situate the story. Rose Dabney Forbes serves as a valuable case study for the growing field of gender history. Her activism does not line up with biographical norms, but forgetting her life because it is not radical or exciting at first glance overlooks the subversive ways that women of the Gilded Age made change. Without lifting a rifle or marching through the streets, Rose Dabney Forbes was, unequivocally, fighting for peace. Thank you. And I can take any
Amazing work. Questions?
Is it? Okay, it was super, super interesting. How did you first hear about Rose Dabney Forbes?
Yeah, so basically I guess I kind of worked backwards. I've been interested in archival work and uncovering biographies specifically for a while at BU. And so when I started this project, I actually subscribed to the view of history that I now don't love, where I just thought every single life that hasn't been written about would be an interesting data point to add to different time periods. And so I contacted the Massachusetts Historical Society to talk to them about some of their archival boxes that haven't been used before. And that's one of the librarians there pointed me towards Rose Dabney Forbes. So I was originally actually literally just going to use her to talk about the peace movement and just like add a data point to it. But once I started going through her documents, I was really curious as to why she wouldn't have been remembered because she was so huge and so influential for her time. And that's when I started to shift away from using her to study the peace movement to using her to study how we study women.
I'm curious. Wonderful presentation, and this is so interesting. And congratulations on being the first.
Oh,
You talk about how Rose Dabney Forbes has been kind of excluded from the narrative, but I'm curious, are there other women who've had sort of similar social roles in using sort of financial influence in peace movements from the Gilded Age that are maybe better remembered, or is it just sort of blanket women have been excluded from the history?
No, there are definitely women who are remembered. For it, one who's huge is Olivia Sage. So she was an incredibly wealthy, though actually one of the wealthiest people, period, in America after her husband and father died. And she gave a lot to the suffrage movement, and she's pretty well remembered for that because of her really like stringent demands and how her money was given like very much with strings attached. So I used a lot of writing about her to kind of construct my arguments about the importance of donating money. Another one that people might resonate with is Isabella Stewart Gardner, huge obviously. And so I think she's a really interesting case study because she was very radical as well. Actually, both Olivia Sage and Isabella Stewart Gardner kind of counter Rose Dabney Forbes in that both of them, even for their time, were seen as pretty radical, whereas Rose Dabney Forbes for her time was very respectful, very respectable, like lined up with social norms. So I think that's one of the reasons that she's less likely to be remembered.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Since this story kind of starts for you in the archive or contacting librarians, has it changed how you would approach archives now or how you would pursue another project starting with archival materials?
Yeah, I think it has. So one thing that I had to grapple with a lot when doing this project, since there were no secondary sources associated with her and I kind of had to figure everything out by myself, was trying to discern how much we can trust historical actors to tell us about themselves. So in the past, I've written a few pieces based on archival work where I was kind of comparing what was in the archive to what had been written about the subject in the past. And even if I was using the archives to counter secondary literature, I still had that basis to kind of like really read other people's analyses. So Rose Dabney Forbes, since I had to construct everything, a lot of what she wrote I don't know necessarily lines up with her actions. And going forward in archival work, I think I'm gonna not use it as much of a fundamental truth as I used to think it was. I really started this project thinking that like you go into the archive, you find these stories, you tell them to the world, and it's like a very straightforward process. And I found it to have a lot more interpretation than I expected.